Sometimes the courtroom isn't just a place for justice, it becomes a battlefield of ideology, power, and personality. That's exactly what happened in a clash that nobody saw coming. Justice Elena Kagan, a sitting Supreme Court justice, found herself at odds with Representative Jasmine Crockett, a rising and outspoken voice in Congress. Comment where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the latest stories. The clash between Justice Elena Kagan and Representative Jasmine Crockett brought to the forefront a deep and rarely acknowledged tension within American government: the boundary between judicial authority and legislative freedom. It's a dynamic that most of the time remains buried under the surface, but when it erupts, it exposes how fragile the balance of power can be. What made this case unique was not only the legal issues at play, but the personalities involved. Two powerful women operating at the highest levels of their respective branches. Justice Elena Kagan, an esteemed member of the U.S. Supreme Court, is widely regarded as a thoughtful and centrist voice on the bench. She has spent much of her career emphasizing institutional respect, legal restraint, and the importance of precedent. But even someone of her stature can find themselves drawn into a political firestorm when the principles they believe in appear to be under threat. In this case, she was deeply concerned by what she saw as a deliberate erosion of the judiciary's independence. Representative Jasmine Crockett, a bold and unapologetic progressive from Texas, had been making headlines with her fiery critiques of the federal judiciary. Her speeches didn't just criticize ruling, she questioned the ethics of sitting judges, the integrity of certain legal decisions, and even called for significant reforms to how judges are appointed and disciplined. The flashpoint came when Crockett made pointed remarks about an ongoing ethics investigation into a federal judge with connections to Kagan's legal sphere. Crockett's comments were sharp, naming names and alleging behind-the-scenes corruption. Although she made these comments in her official capacity as a member of Congress, it triggered alarm bells in certain legal circles. A federal court issued a broad gag order related to the case, which Crockett ignored, insisting she had both the duty and the constitutional right to speak out. That decision set the stage for the unthinkable, an effort reportedly supported by Kagan to bring Crockett before the court for contempt. To outside observers, the idea that a Supreme Court justice might support action that could result in the jailing of a sitting member of Congress was shocking. But for Kagan, the issue wasn't about silencing a lawmaker, it was about protecting the judicial process from being undermined in public before it had time to complete its work. From her perspective, Crockett's statements weren't just controversial, they threatened the legitimacy of a system that depends on perceived impartiality and respect. Crockett, however, framed the issue differently. To her, the attempt to discipline her was a dangerous overreach. She cited the Constitution's speech or debate clause, which protects legislators from legal action based on their official duties. Her argument wasn't just a legal one, it was a philosophical stand. If judges could police the speech of elected lawmakers, then the foundation of checks and balances would be compromised. The court's power, Crockett argued, must stop at the edge of Congress's independence. The result was a standoff between two branches of government and between two women who believed they were defending democracy in their own ways. For Kagan, it was about upholding the integrity of the courts. For Crockett, it was about safeguarding the voice of the people through their elected representatives. This conflict pulled into focus how the American system, built on a delicate balance of power, can quickly descend into confrontation when those lines are tested. In today's political and legal landscape, power isn't just exercised in courtrooms or congressional chambers, it's wielded in full view of the public through media channels, press conferences, social platforms, and strategic leaks. This was never more apparent than during the explosive confrontation between Justice Elena Kagan and Representative Jasmine Crockett. While the core of the dispute revolved around constitutional interpretation and interbranch limits, the real battleground was public perception. And in that arena, Crockett proved far more agile. The moment word got out that legal pressure was being mounted against Crockett, possibly with the backing of Justice Kagan, it triggered a media frenzy. Cable news lit up with round-the-clock coverage. Some commentators viewed the move as a justified attempt to rein in a rogue lawmaker who had crossed ethical lines, but many others saw it as a dangerous precedent, one that echoed the kind of judicial authoritarianism the founders had feared. Crockett understood the stakes immediately. Rather than retreating into silence or legal maneuvering, she went on the offensive, not in court, but in front of cameras. Crockett organized a press conference outside the Capitol that drew national attention, flanked by colleagues, legal scholars, and even civil liberties advocates who didn't always align with her politics. She walked the public through her version of events. She disclosed previously unseen correspondence, documents from congressional ethics briefings, and explained in plain terms her constitutional right to speak on issues of judicial conduct. More than that, she made it about accountability, not just for her, but for the entire system. She asked pointedly, "If I can't ask questions about judicial behavior, who can?" Justice Kagan, for her part, remained largely silent. As a Supreme Court justice, she's bound by a tradition of public neutrality and rarely addresses ongoing political controversy. That silence, however, came at a cost. In a media landscape that rewards immediacy, Crockett's side of the story went unchallenged for days. Her narrative, one of a lawmaker standing up against elite suppression, spread rapidly online. Viral clips of her speeches, particularly one where she held up a pocket constitution while quoting the speech or debate clause, flooded social media platforms. Influencers, political analysts, and even some legal professionals weighed in, calling the alleged judicial push against her unprecedented and out of line. The speed and volume of public support were staggering. Hashtags trended nationwide. Online petitions gained hundreds of thousands of signatures. Civil rights organizations began issuing statements. Crockett had successfully shifted the focus from the legality of her statement to the legitimacy of the judiciary's attempt to silence. It was no longer a technical matter. It was now a symbolic showdown between the voice of the people and the perceived overreach of an untouchable elite. Justice Kagan likely hadn't anticipated this level of blowback. Her concern had been, by all accounts, with protecting judicial credibility in an era when public trust in instances is already dangerously low. But by allowing her name to be associated with a move to sanction an elected official, especially one as media-savvy and defiant as Crockett, she unintentionally gave that official a platform. And Crockett knew exactly how to use it. This episode reinforced a crucial reality of modern governance. Legal battles are rarely confined to legal venues. They unfold in the court of public opinion where clarity and relatability often carry more weight than precedent or doctrine. Crockett's ability to seize control of the narrative didn't just diffuse the threat against her, it put the judiciary itself on the defensive. At the heart of the standoff between Representative Jasmine Crockett and Justice Elena Kagan was a critical, often underappreciated constitutional protection. The speech or debate clause found in Article 1, Section 6 of the U.S. Constitution. This clause ensures that members of Congress cannot be prosecuted or questioned in any other place for any speech or debate occurring in the course of their legislative duties. It's a safeguard meant to preserve the independence of the legislative branch, shielding lawmakers from retaliation by the executive or judiciary. In this particular case, it became Crockett's most powerful defense and one that ultimately shaped the conversation. The controversy began when Crockett made a series of public statements criticizing the conduct of a federal judge under ethics investigation. These comments, while bold and unusually direct, were made in the context of her official congressional role, both on the House floor and in committee hearing. When a court allegedly under pressure from high-ranking legal figures, including Justice Kagan, sought to bring her in for contempt, Crockett and her legal team quickly pointed speech or debate clause as a constitutional firewall. Boundaries likely did not grasp the potency of this clause in protecting legislative conduct. In her view, Crockett's comments weren't limited to legislative responsibility. They were inflammatory, mediating, and disrupted a judicial investigation. Defenders of Kagan's approach put forward that no one should escape, even elected representatives. But the judicial history of the speech and debate clause is unequivocal. Provided a statement is part of legislative activity, it is shielded, whether it offends, upsets, or conflicts with operation in some other branch. Crockett's staff lost no time in informing the public about this arcane but important aspect of the Constitution. They described the clause in interviews, press conferences, and official statements as a bedrock of democracy. one crafted specifically for situations as this. Crockett maintained that the clause wasn't safeguarding her personal, but safeguarding the voice of each voter who had elected to send a representative to Washington to check power when it was necessary. Legal academics started opining. Others argued that the judicial branch, including judges such as Kagan, knew better than to even tempt the notion of punishing a legislator for official speech. Still others argued over whether or not Crockett's media appearances and social media usage clouded the definition of what qualified as legislative activity. But one thing was certain: the very effort to circumvent this constitutional safeguard caused a wider controversy over the boundaries of judicial authority. Ironically, the more Kagan and her allies attempted to characterize Crockett's comments as inappropriate or perilous, the greater the spotlight they shone on the safeguards she invoked. Crockett seized the moment. She spoke on the House floor about the history of the clause, referencing the founders and citing examples from the past in which lawmakers employed it to resist excess. Her message was clear: if we permit the judiciary to muzzle Congress, then we undermine the pillar of representative government. This legal bulwark did not protect Crockett alone. It revealed the vulnerability of institutional boundaries when passions are strong. Even Justice Kagan, as experienced and well-regarded as she is, seemed to overestimate the costs of defiance of so deeply ingrained a constitutional convention. Ultimately, however, the speech or debate clause did not merely preserve Crockett from possible legal risk. It reminded us that the separation of powers, though fragile, is supported not only by custom, but also by positive constitutional intent. The clash between Representative Jasmine Crockett and Justice Elena Kagan not only ignited a constitutional controversy, but also provided the stage for an incredible public reputation turnaround. What started out as an alleged overreach by a daring legislator turned rapidly into a focus on the judiciary that left Justice Kagan in an uncharacteristically exposed position. In a surprise few expected, the effort to discipline Crockett concluded, elevating her voice and raising questions about Kagan's judgment, not as a lawyer, but in the appearance of her involvement in what appeared to be a politically motivated response. Justice Elena Kagan, whose keen mind and generally even-handed temperament on the court make her a force to be reckoned with, made her mark in this debate not by a direct Supreme Court ruling, but by influence and tacit approval. It was reported by several sources close to that Kagan secretly endorsed the notion of judicial intervention after Crockett's statements regarding an ethics probe into a federal judge. While not publicly acknowledged, Kagan's support of court action against Crockett caused ripples behind the scenes and immediately into public view. The notion that a Supreme Court justice, if only indirectly, would be behind an effort to punish a sitting Congress shook people broadside. It was no longer just about law. It was now about power and how it might be abused. Crockett took advantage. Instead of cringing under pressure or issuing apologies, she welcomed the conflict as a challenge to democratic value. She positioned herself as a public servant who resisted judicial intimidation. With social media press appearances, she portrayed the whole episode as an attempt by to stifle a voice that would not conform. She took the confrontation out of herself and made it about a system in which too many individual authority worked behind closed doors and beyond public oversight. The louder Crockett talked, the more people started to hear her. The story started to change. Rather than being characterized as reckless or disobedient, she was now being described as brave and ethical. That move had a direct and inverse impact on Kagan's public perception. While she was quiet according to Supreme Court standards, the silence was seen by some as coldness or worse, culpability. Legal analysts and commentators started wondering why a justice who was respected for her insight would seem to be condoning punitive action against a legislator who was merely performance responsibility. Media commentary and public opinion surveys registered the shift. Support for Crockett grew, especially from young voters and civil liberties groups. Editorials criticized the judiciary's lack of openness and called for more oversight of exercise of power behind closed doors. Meanwhile, Kagan, who had long enjoyed respect across ideological lines, began to face rare criticism, not for her court ruling, but for her perceived role in this political. This episode underscored how quickly reputation shift in the age of 24-hour and digital. Crockett, initially seen as pushing the envelope, emerged as a defender of Kagan, despite her long-standing judicial credibility, found herself on the defensive, accused of supporting an action to challenge legislative independence. What this reveals is the fragility of institutional reputation when actions, real or perceived, conflict with public expectations of fairness and balance. The court, and Kagan in particular, was not immune to public scrutiny. In attempting to make an example out of Crockett, the roles were reversed. It was Kagan who found herself at the center of awkward queries regarding power, overreaching, and the perception of impartiality. The showdown between Justice Elena Kagan and Representative Jasmine Crockett is a watershed moment in the continuing dialogue about power, responsibility, and the constitutional limits that guide America's democratic institution. What started as a specific reaction to a legislator's chutzpah turned into a broader public accounting of the roles and boundaries of both the judiciary and the legislature. Ultimately, this confrontation didn't only impact the reputations of the participants, it precipitated a national conversation that underscored how thin the power balance can be when tradition meets transparency. Justice Kagan, a longtime respected figure for her measured, careful style on the Supreme Court, was suddenly drawn into the political limelight, albeit indirectly at first, although she did not directly use judicial authority to act against Crockett. Her alleged endorsement of a legal plan to censure or punish a sitting member of Congress raised grave ethical and constitutional issues. The judiciary by nature should exist outside politics, an unyielding custodian of the law. But in this case, Kagan's perceived entanglement blurred that boundary. It reminded everyone that even the most ethical of individuals can find themselves walking a thin line between danger when institutional allegiance meets personal belief. Conversely, Jasmine Crockett created a political moment out of an instant of legal danger. By basing her defense on the Constitution and addressing her arguments directly to the public, she successfully redefined the issue. Rather than being characterized as irresponsible or contemptuous of the courts, she presented herself as a defender of legislative autonomy and a champion of democratic principles. Crockett's tactical invocation of the speech or debate clause was not merely a wellspring of good law, but a shrewd symbolic gesture that appealed to a public growing suspicious of unaccountable power. Public opinion cannot be overemphasized in this tale. Crockett's skill at rallying media coverage, organizing supporters, and reducing a sophisticated constitutional problem to a shareable value-based message enabled her to set the agenda. Conversely, Kagan's strict adherence to the traditional Supreme Court silence created a void, one which Crockett filled with her own version of events. The disparity in public spin radically changed reputation. Kagan, possibly attempting to save the judiciary's dignity, ended up appearing before some as if she was complicit in an act of excess. Crockett, whose behavior was initially considered doubtful, emerged as a beacon of defiance against elite overreach. Ultimately, this incident reaffirms a central truth: constitutional authority is not merely about what the law permits, but about how the public understands and responds to the exercise of that authority. The rivalry between government branches is not necessarily adversarial. It's actually a structural element of the American system. But the moment those tensions spill into efforts to silence, punish, or suppress elected voices, the system begins to show cracks. The lesson here isn't about individual victory or defeat. It's about the importance of respecting the limits of institutional power, even when provoked. And perhaps most importantly, it shows that in a democratic society, no title or robe is immune to the consequences of public accountability.